A most unusual education. As the scion of a noble family, Michel de Montaigne could have spent his early days surrounded by servants and coddled in luxury. Instead, his parents sent their boy to live with a local peasant family, not out of neglect, but to give him something he couldn't get at home. Most wealthy children in the 16th century were handed over to wet nurses and nannies. But Montaigne, within sight but a world away from the enormous estate that bore his name, was, in his words, formed by fortune under the laws of the common people and of nature. It was an unusual beginning to an unusual education, one that would continue until Montaigne took his last breath at age 59. After those early days in the bosom of his surrogate family, Montaigne was brought home, where his father decreed that no one would speak any language around his son but Latin. Instead of their local dialect of French, Montaigne lived in the world of Horace and Cato, coming naturally to the language the same way the ancients had. Even residents of the village went along with the plan, and years later, Montaigne was surprised to hear one of them casually refer to a tool by its Latin name, so ingrained had the habit become for his sake. With no other languages allowed within earshot, his Latin tutor was German and didn't even know French, the mother tongue of philosophy came to the boy quickly and painlessly. The Romans had first come to Bordeaux around 60 BC, and Rome had fallen in the centuries since. But for Montaigne, the eternal city still stood. Soon enough, Montaigne was more fluent than his parents, more proficient than his tutor. As for me, Montaigne would later recall, I was over 6 before I understood any more French than Arabic. One might expect that an education this strict and directed, not to mention strange, would be joyless. Montaigne was lucky, for he was formed as much by love and tenderness as he was by these experiments. He would be taught Greek later, a little more traditionally, but his father envisioned it as a game. Montaigne would recall the fun of volleying conjugations back and forth with his instructors, not even aware that he was learning. Montaigne recalled that in his father's travels abroad, educational experts had advised him to shape his son's soul entirely through gentleness and freedom, that his choices should be respected and that he should love to learn. Is it any surprise that Montaigne would go to his deathbed believing that he had the best father there ever was? Only twice in his life was Montaigne ever physically disciplined. Gently, he noted, something that many children today could not say and few could have said in the 16th century. Most mornings he was awakened not by a nagging parent or a stern schoolmaster, but by beautiful songs of the musicians whom his father had hired. It was a way to teach his son music, but it was also a way to address a rather touching concern. Startling the tender brains of children awake with a shake or a shout, his father believed, was borderline cruel. At 7, Montaigne was reading Ovid for fun, already tired of patronizing kids' stories. But he wasn't just a bookworm. In the Montaigne household, everything was an opportunity to learn. Even pranks or mistakes were material for discussions or lessons. Everything was designed to serve as an excellent book. Every situation provided a takeaway. Even some cheating by a page, some stupidity on the part of a lackey, something said at the table, was a chance to discuss, to debate, to analyze. Everything was to be questioned, every idea to be traced back to its original source. Great thinkers were turned to for advice and for answers, but they were not exempt from challenges. Pass everything through a sieve, Montaigne would later say about how to educate a child, and lodge nothing in his head on mere authority or trust. He was taught not to be precious about mistakes, encouraged to admit he had made them. The important thing to teach kids, he said of the real lesson he learned in his youth, was that confessing an error which he discovers in his own argument, even when he alone has noticed it, is an act of justice and integrity, which are the main qualities he pursues. In Montaigne's family, stubbornness was a vice, belief in one's infallibility or superiority the only screw-up to be ashamed of. It must have been shocking the first time Montaigne stepped into a classroom at the Collège de Guyenne, which his father had helped start. To suddenly be surrounded by other students doing this thing called school? As Montaigne would have known, the root of the Greek word for school means leisure. Then, as now, how distant the etymology is from reality. Montaigne did not love how often he and his fellow students were left to the melancholy humor of a furious schoolmaster. There was so much schoolwork, the days were interminable. He and his fellow students found it excruciating, slaving away for 14 and 15 hours a day like a porter. They were forced to memorize and recite and translate passages as if these noises and sounds and symbols were a replacement for understanding. It is tragic, Montaigne felt, but not a surprise, how many kids hate going to school, and sadder still, how many teachers hate their students. Just as birds carry food in their beaks without tasting it to stuff it down the beaks of their young, Montaigne said, our schoolmasters go foraging for learning in their books and merely lodge it on the tip of their lips, only to spew it out and scatter it on the wind. His fellow students who could repeat what they'd learned from their teachers, they were no more than parrots, he said. To know by heart is not to know, Montaigne would write later. It is to keep what they have given you and store it in your memory. School taught him the basics, math, logic, poetry, but he dreamed of gaining control over his own studies and was later envious to learn that Socrates would let his pupils do most of the talking. Unlike his schooling, the rest of his early education was active. Dancing, horseback riding, handling a pike, playing an instrument. He took instruction in it all. Montaigne and his brothers both learned the French game of tennis, which was unusual, for athletics were not considered important then. Montaigne joked that many of his fellow students would have been better off if they'd only received tennis lessons, because they would have been spared the schooling and at least gotten in shape. They would have also been spared, he noted, the ego that came along with the sense that they had been educated. In any case, he was raised not to be some effete intellectual, but an active and vigorous young man. The saving grace of any institution of learning is its teachers. For all the flaws and frustrations of his traditional education, Montaigne was blessed with several great teachers. One, George Buchanan, was in Bordeaux fleeing religious persecution. This future tutor of kings was a long way from home, and he was able to give the young Montaigne a worldly perspective. Buchanan loved theater and staged many plays at school, dragging this unusual boy into performing in them. Perhaps Buchanan was the teacher Montaigne later credited for encouraging his reading habit. In a time when books were expensive and censorship commonplace, this teacher understood that Montaigne's curiosity could not be satisfied by the school syllabus. They came to an agreement. As long as Montaigne could keep up with the school's assignments, he was free to explore on his own. We can imagine Buchanan nudging Montaigne this way and that, even lending him copies from his own library. Pretending to see nothing, Montaigne said gratefully, he whetted my appetite, letting me gorge myself with these books, only in secret. It was a brilliant stroke, too, for Montaigne watched as so many of his fellow students came away from school hating to read. One of the books he found was a beautiful folio copy of the works of Terence, edited by the scholar Erasmus, which Montaigne bought for himself in 1549 at age 16. He was still reading and rereading it late in life, finding it impossible each time he picked Terence up not to find in him some new beauty and grace. He finished school several years ahead of schedule. He had done well. He had had a better experience than most. But for all that, he said, summarizing his college experience, it was still school. What did he have to show for his years there? Nothing compared to what he'd gotten at home, where he'd learned to love to learn. The aim of education has always been to spark curiosity, the desire to understand the world and one's place in it. Often, this is precisely what is snuffed out. Of all the inheritances the boy would get, which would include enormous tracts of land, a winery, and a castle. This was his greatest blessing. He grew up constrained by some of the most bizarre limits ever imposed on a child, Montaigne's biographer Sarah Bakewell observed, and at the same time he had almost unlimited freedom. He was a world unto himself. Yet eventually, like all graduates, Montaigne had to enter the actual world. His father had always understood that his son's education was not merely for its own sake, but to prepare the boy to run the family business, to hold office, to be a leader, to contribute to society by being a torchbearer for values that not long ago had been lost in a dark age. Perhaps Montaigne would have loved to remain a scholar, but life and his father had other plans. To school learning he owes but the first 15 or 16 years of his life, Montaigne wrote later. The rest is owed to action. We all face this transition from school to experience, from the classroom to the school of life. All the things that Montaigne had read about, Greek democracy, the Roman Empire, the law cases of Cicero, the power of the medieval church, he would now come face to face with, not in the glow of the golden age, but in the messy, muddy present moment. After his legal studies, Montaigne found himself working as a magistrate in the Bordeaux Parliament, a job that involved assessing complex legal cases and liaisoning with different courts. In those days, magistrates were considered and interviewed along two very different lines. One approach, which is still used to this day, was to evaluate an applicant's academic performance and ability by giving them a test on their knowledge. A simpler approach was to give a future magistrate a case to judge and see how they performed, which would reveal how their mind worked. The latter was a superior procedure, Montaigne noted, even though both those are necessary and both needed together. Nevertheless, he said the talent for knowledge is less to be prized than that for judging. Judgment can do without knowledge, but not knowledge without judgment. Montaigne almost certainly got his job through the connections of his father, but over the 15 years he held it, he came to understand that knowing the law and understanding it were very different things. He would have learned, as great legal minds have all learned, that the theory has to be made to fit reality and not the other way around, that only real painful experience can teach someone how to master their profession. Much had been left out of the books, Montaigne quickly realized when he encountered the complexity of the human heart or considered the ambiguity of outcomes. Not that his colleagues approached their profession with much thought. Montaigne would recall with horror watching a judge he knew to be unfaithful to his wife sentence a defendant for the very same crime, just before writing his mistress a love note. Year after year on the job, Montaigne developed this judgment about what makes people tick, how to spot a liar, how to get to the truth of a matter. It was for this reason that he was recruited to serve at the court of King Charles IX, and why, at the end of his legal career, he was awarded the Order of St. Michael, effectively French knighthood. To enter the real world is a shock to all young people. The transition from the realm of ideas to the realm of kings and criminal courts was always going to be a messy and disappointing one. But the France that Montaigne navigated and inhabited must have seemed like it was unraveling. A generation earlier, Michelangelo had painted the Sistine Chapel. Magellan had circumnavigated the globe. Copernicus had displaced the earth from the center of the universe. The Renaissance had flowered, bringing with it beautiful art and earth-shattering awakenings. A new world was discovered across the Atlantic. As word of different cultures trickled back, each man's sense of the size and shape of the globe had to be reconsidered. Alongside discovery and invention, however, came destabilization. The church, which had long been a unifying force, had been undermined by these new forms of thought, by the new technologies that spread new ideas. There was, in Montaigne's expression, a common belief that the world is turned upside down. For the first time, people began to question the oppressive role that priests played in society. And even more generally, they began to ask, why are things this way? And should they continue this way? Martin Luther tacked his theses to the door of the church. Reformation and counter-reformation followed. Riots and unrest ensued. New faiths emerged, and they battled not just on their right to exist, but for the power to crush all others as heresies. Inquisitions and persecution raged. The flower of Renaissance withered up there on the scaffold. The tolerance and acceptance of the Enlightenment lay centuries in the future. It was and remained, as one scholar said, a world still lit only by fire. In 1562, Montaigne, then serving Charles IX, witnessed the carnage from the siege of Rouen, a violent Catholic insurrection in which more than 1,000 people were killed in a bloody clash over religious tensions dividing France. Just a few months earlier, the Duke of Guise had massacred dozens of French Huguenots attending a church service in the town of Vassy. A year later, the Duke himself would be gunned down by the side of the road by another French nobleman who lay in wait. When the assassin was caught, he was drawn and quartered, except the sentence was botched. And when the man's limbs failed to be ripped from their sockets after multiple attempts, he was finally put out of his misery by the executioner's sword. Reprisal followed reprisal, culminating in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where tens of thousands were killed, the dead dumped in the river. All of this must have seemed particularly horrifying to a man who had been taught intellectual humility, who believed that ideas should be questioned and that humans were prone to error. It is to take one's conjectures rather seriously, Montaigne would say, to roast someone alive for them. Yet this was common practice over the course of his life. Thousands of people were burned at the stake for mostly imagined crimes. In the Inquisition, multiple relatives of Montaigne had been burned to death, including a great-great-great-grandfather. The French wars of religion lasted for decades, claiming the lives of over 1 million people, many in almost indescribably heinous ways. How far this was from the idyllic and sheltered days of his youth, when his father had protected him from the carnage and its fallout all around him, when his teachers smiled upon him, encouraging all his curiosity and eccentricity. In a world still medieval in practice, defined by fear and persecution, being a free and unconventional thinker was a risky proposition. So was standing out. As new money merchants, the Montaigne family could not help it. Montaigne's mother's side of the family were Marranos, Spanish Jews who during the Inquisition converted to Christianity under the threat of death. His paternal uncles were Protestant. When Montaigne read about people different from himself, especially observations about the just discovered peoples living in the New World, he was curious rather than judgmental. So many humors, sects, judgments, opinions, laws, and customs teach us to judge sanely of our own, he said. Did the people of the Amazon draw and quarter one another, burn one another at the stake, accuse one another of black magic? Who was actually the barbarian? Later, he would strike a coin for himself to carry as a reminder. I reserve judgment, it said. He would not be sucked into fanaticism and fundamentalism. He would not take part in quarrels and conflict. He would not chase what everyone else chased, strive to beat or surpass anyone. He would keep a cool head while the rest of the world lost theirs. This discipline, this tolerance, did not win him the friends it should have. He sensed that he was a man without a country. He knew he had a target on his back. I was belabored from every quarter, Montaigne lamented. To the Ghibelline, I was a Guelph. To the Guelph, a Ghibelline. Those who refuse to pick sides make twice as many enemies. He must have sensed he was reaching the end of the road of public service. How could a person attend to the affairs of state when murder and persecution were publicly accepted? When had extremism become commonplace? When had the future felt so uncertain? Only he knows, the novelist Stefan Zweig would write as he turned to Montaigne's works during the early days of the rise of Nazism, that no task on earth is more burdensome and difficult than to maintain one's intellectual and moral independence and preserve it unsullied through a mass cataclysm. To not be made crazy by the craziness around you demands courage and discipline and justice and wisdom. The cataclysm came for Montaigne at the end of the 1560s in an unexpected way. Out for a ride on his estate, Montaigne smashed into another rider at full speed and was thrown to the ground. As his friends carried his broken, dying body to the house, Montaigne felt his life escaping him, his soul all but dancing on the tip of his lips. Just as suddenly, life returned, and Montaigne was given a second chance. Imagine that you have died, Marcus Aurelius writes in Meditations. Now take what's left of your life and live it properly. Marcus is one of the few Stoics Montaigne never quotes, but he got the idea. In the light of this near-death experience, the law didn't seem so important. The affairs and rituals of court must have seemed almost painfully stupid, even grotesque. So he walked away. In the year of Christ 1571, he wrote in an inscription he had learned by his father's methods, Montaigne, aged 38, on his birthday, the day preceding the calends of March, already long wearied of the servitude of the law courts and of public offices, has retired, with faculties still entire, to the arms of the learned virgins, there to pass in all quiet and security such length of days as to remain to him, of his already more than half-spent years, if the fates permit him to finish this abode and these sweet ancestral retreats consecrated to his freedom and tranquility and leisure. Here, then, in this library, the man whose education had so long been directed and supervised was taking the reins fully in his hands. His father was dead, his career lifeless. He himself had nearly died. His life was now half over or more, having been dedicated to studying other people, working on other people's problems. Now, he said, enough, and he put himself to following that ancient command from the great oracle at Delphi, know thyself. For the first few years after the accident, it seemed all Montaigne did was read. In a tower on the estate his father had left him, he arranged his books on long wraparound shelves that hugged the walls of the circular building. He could take in his entire library in a glance, thousands of books, a life of learning arrayed before him. Montaigne turned the room his father had used as a chapel into a temple of wisdom. Books are my kingdom, he said, and here I seek to reign as absolute Lord. When he wasn't reading, he was thinking, luxuriating in his own company and the freedom to nurture his own thoughts, to exercise his mind. He wanders about the room, one biographer portrays Montaigne in his element, taking from his shelves one book after another, opening them at random, reading a scrap and then talking about it. On he goes, talking wisely, wittily, kindly, while the flickering firelight plays over his sensitive, intelligent face, and the fast-gone moon shines in patches on the floor. To the world we are used to dissolves under his talk, and its constituent parts wave and flicker with the firelight. On the shelves was his copy of Terence from school. There were the Stoics. There was Lucretius, Horace, Virgil, and Diogenes Laertius. There was his beloved Plutarch. What profit will he not get out of reading the lives of our favorite Plutarch, Montaigne would say rapturously, celebrating this ancient biographer, not for the way he recorded the date of the fall of Carthage, as the behavior of Hannibal and Scipio, less the name of the place where Marcellus died as to how his death there showed him unworthy of the task. Montaigne had taken pains to carve some of his favorite quotes into the beams of the ceiling of his study, right above the books. Many were from Sextus Empiricus, the Greek philosopher. Lines like, I do not understand, I stop, I examine. From Terence, I am a man and nothing human is foreign to me. From Socrates, impiety follows pride like a dog. From Pliny, the only certainty is that nothing is certain. And of course, from Epictetus, that which worries men is not things, but that which they think about them. Is it any wonder then when Montaigne sat down to write, he began with a question and not a statement? Que sais-je? What do I know? What did Montaigne know about himself? What had he learned from his unique education, from his books, from his peasant godparents, from his father, from his teachers? What did he really, truly know? Stepping back from the deranged violence of his time, he decided to explore the human condition in the form of rambling meditations, some no more than a page, some almost the length of a short book. An essay is what he called it, or in French, an attempt. Montaigne wrote on many topics: fear, idleness, affection we feel for our children, cruelty, experience. He also wrote about his favorite authors and the cannibals he'd heard about in the New World. But the topics of these essays were at most a jumping-off point, an excuse to explore and consider anything that struck him as interesting. And in the end, they all came back to the main character in his search, himself. I would rather be an authority on myself than on Cicero, he said. He follows his subject as a young dog follows a carriage, hounding off the road 100 times to investigate the neighborhood, one biographer writes. His loose-limbed mind is easy, light, yet serious. He pares away the rind of things, smelling the fruit joyously. He is a considerer, an examiner, a skeptic. He prowls about the beliefs, the opinions and usage of men, and taking up a thought, lifts from it one by one as if he were peeling an artichoke, the envelopes of custom, of prejudices, of time, of place. He holds up the opinion of one school, praising and admiring it, and then the contradictory opinion of another school, praising and admiring that. In his scales, he balances notion against notion, man against man, usage against usage. Being born into a world that was so chaotic had presented Montaigne with an opportunity. For too long, the church had been the authority on everything. Still, too much knowledge lay cloistered in monasteries, inaccessible and impractical. For centuries, the individual had been told they were insignificant. Truths long held as irrefutable were proved laughably incorrect by Columbus and Copernicus. Basic questions that had long gone unasked, and certainly remained unanswered, were now bubbling to the surface. Simply the fact that no one had ever really written an essay before is case in point. Staring at his cat one day, entertaining it with a toy, he stops and wonders, who is toying with who? His essays abound with animal stories, intended to illustrate that there is a vast, beautiful world out there that we hardly experience, in some cases that we can't even begin to imagine. What was his cat thinking when he played with it? Who was he to that cat? He was just as baffled by his own anatomy, his sex drive, his emotions. He just wants to know anything and everything. How fresh this all was, how new and transgressive even. The idea that learning mattered, that truth mattered, that Montaigne, that the individual was a topic worth exploring. But just because some of it was simple, just because it was fun, doesn't mean the answers were easy. It is a thorny enterprise, he said, of following a path as wandering as that of the mind and penetrating the dark depths of its inner folds. It was, he wanted the reader to know, more difficult than it looked. For nearly a decade, Montaigne noodled on these essays, which came to fill more than 1,000 pages in all, writing them primarily for his own benefit, and in the process creating a very different kind of self-improvement. Would anyone care? As civil war tore through France, as people fought over scraps of religious doctrine, he waged a war against his own ignorance exploring the things that make human beings strange and wonderful. It would be his lasting contribution to humanity. He pulled at the thread that artists and journalists and social scientists and psychologists and memoirists have been weaving with since. In 1580, he published his first essays, which quickly made their way into the homes of nearly every literate gentleman in France. King Henry III read a copy. Francis Bacon read and loved them. In 1603, when Montaigne was translated into English, a self-taught playwright and fellow lover of Plutarch named William Shakespeare bought a copy. Indeed, a passage from Montaigne appears deftly cribbed in The Tempest and may have inspired one of his most famous lines, "This, above all, to thine own self be true." The books Montaigne had written solely for himself turned out to be for everyone and became what we would call bestsellers, and remain so to this day. Montaigne celebrated the completion of his work and its success by doing something he had not gotten to do for many years: travel. Ostensibly, he had to get from France to Italy for business, but mostly he was using the trip as a chance to see new places and have new experiences. And all the while, he kept learning and writing and taking stuff in. Here he is exploring some old ruin. Here he is under a tree reading a book. Here he is in the streets of Rome speaking aloud to Caesar and Cicero, muttering their great names between my teeth and making them resound in my ears. Here he is in an inn, his essays laid out before him, delighted by something he'd written, or when he was embarrassed by it, not hesitating to change it. Here he is struck by a bit of inspiration, dictating a few sentences to his page as they trot along. Here he is with some new book he's purchased, adding yet another heavy volume to his saddlebags. Books are, he said, the best provision a man can take with him on life's journey. Ultimately, he could not completely withdraw from public life. No wise man can. He consulted on fortifications for Parliament. He was named Gentleman of the Chamber by Henry de Navarre, the next king of France. He hosted important guests for dinner. He went on diplomatic missions. He corresponded with the leading minds of his time. He was elected mayor of Bordeaux, now a large and important city, and then re-elected. At one point, the persecution he had dreaded came, and he was thrown in the Bastille. But now his fame saved him, and he was freed by Catherine de' Medici. Throughout it all, though, he was still reading, still writing, still revising his essays. Even in the last months of his life, he was consulting for King Henry III, trying to make him into a philosopher king. He had asked in Rome to be made an honorary citizen, but in fact he was a citizen of the world. A friend to himself and to all, he lived outside time and place, residing and conversing with the worthiest minds who had lived in the best ages, as he had since boyhood. He made his mark not in the political arena, not on the battlefield, not even in the form of scientific breakthroughs or some work of scholarship. Instead, he persisted in the educational experiment that dated back to his childhood, his father's vision for his son, and the son's effort to prove himself worthy of all the expectation and effort that his teachers had put upon him. He had explored an unknown and unprecedented new continent, himself. He had asked more questions than he had answered, read more than he wrote, saw more than he understood. He tried to put himself and his times in perspective. It will be a lot, he wrote, if 100 years from now people remember in a general way that in our time there was civil wars in France. He knew he would be largely forgotten. He refused to despair. He declined to write humanity off. And in this, he was truly a wise man. What can we say we know? What can we say we have learned from the life of Montaigne? First, that education is something that does not end. We know that an education, even if directed by someone else at the beginning, eventually reverts into our own hands. We must teach ourselves if we are to learn anything. We know from Montaigne that ego is the enemy of wisdom, that conceit is the impediment to knowledge. We take from his example the need to always be curious, always questioning, always open, always ready to learn something new. And finally, we understand that we learn in order to live, that all accomplishments pale in comparison to that rarest of rare things, self-awareness. His education began with a fresh vision and relied on unconventional methods, the most unique being that it never stopped. As a young man, he explained, I studied in order to show off. Later, a little to make myself wiser. Now I do it for amusement, never for profit. He kept learning until the day he died. And indeed, the questions that he asked, the inner journey he so eloquently described, continues on through each of us today. If, and only if, we are brave and disciplined enough to pick up the task he lays before us.